Patrick Hunter here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. For those of you who are unfamiliar, I would usually be here with at least one other person. Usually it's my buddy Aris Pina, and we're almost always talking some mixture of boxing history, true crime, and bare knuckle. And today I'm going to be fulfilling that bare knuckle obligation, doing the knuckle portion of the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. There is this week on December 9th a BKFC event in Tampa, Florida. That's the Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship. It's headlined by lightweights Martin Trey Brown and Bobby ODB Taylor, who are both undefeated in the BKFC. This fight sets up a title shot against lightweight champion Luis Palomino. So this fight card is actually fairly important for that reason. Let's go ahead and run it down because I did a lot of research. I did a lot of scouting. I got a scouting report to give, so let's go ahead and do it. Again, that main event is at lightweight. That's 155 pounds in the BKFC. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the divisions are a little bit different in terms of the weights, but Martin Trey Brown, as I said, undefeated in the BKFC, 2-0. 2 decision wins. He's based out of Tampa. He's 37 years old, 19 fights in mixed martial arts. That's a recurring theme you're going to see in not only the BKFC, but bare knuckle in general. They're kind of pulling athletes from other combat sports as the sport continues to grow, and more fighters are kind of staking their tents down in bare knuckle. So Martin Trey Brown has 19 fights in mixed martial arts. He's 14-5 according to Tapology, and 4 of those 14 wins come by way of strike and or ground and pound. So he obviously has some pretty good hands, and he has some pretty good hands based off of the video I've seen too. He looks somewhat comfortable in the clinch. That clinch game is going to be something really important for bare knuckle and something that we're going to wind up coming back to for sure. But Martin Brown's obviously better at a mid-range if you look at him fight. One big concern going into this fight, at least for me, would be that he tore his ACL against Zach Zane in his last BKFC fight. Now, Zach Zane is a mixed martial artist himself, a lot of experience. He kind of hip-tossed Martin Brown a little bit, and that's what wound up tearing his ACL. But Martin Brown elected to continue. Clearly very tough, a lot of resolve, a lot of determination, and that's going to be something to be looking at going into this fight, his motivation and his kind of mental outlook, I guess. But I would imagine that it would be strong against Bobby ODB Taylor. So Bobby Taylor is 3-0 in BKFC. He has 1 knockout. He fights out of Tennessee. He's 43 years old, and he has 17 fights in mixed martial arts with a 6-11 record. And of those 6 fights, 4 wins by way of strikes, knockout, stoppage. And he is obviously willing to mix it up, throws pretty freely. He was outboxed in spots, though, by Luis Hernandez, who is a pro boxer and does not have a stellar record in pro boxing. But he also had a really bad swelling and a cut on his eye against Hernandez. So that's something I would definitely be concerned about going into this fight against Martin Brown, who has pretty good hands, and at least before his ACL tear, was able to maneuver pretty well. But that being said, if they wind up clashing, if they wind up coming into a collision, into the clinch, it's going to get very, very interesting. The second fight on this BKFC Tampa card is at flyweight. That's 125 pounds in the BKFC. And we're going to see Taylor Killaby Starling, who is 2-0 in the BKFC. She has 1 stoppage, and so she's fighting out of South Carolina. She has 2 fights in mixed martial arts, going 1-1, and 2 pro kickboxing fights, going 0-2. She has that about 30-second or so, I think it was 28-second stoppage of Cassie Robb in the BKFC. Obviously, very big, very emphatic win that a lot of us saw fairly recently. And she also had that memorable war against Charissa Segala. They both took a lot of facial damage in that fight. Charissa Segala had that awful swelling on her forehead, and Taylor Starling just was cut and bruised all to heck. And so those kinds of things, the facial damage doesn't happen in a vacuum. It can heal, but especially if there are cuts going forward, that scar tissue opening up is always going to be a concern after that. So that's something to really look forward going into here. She was actually forced to back out of BKFC Montana in October of 2021, a couple months ago, because her opponent missed weight by a lot and then was given more time to make weight and came back even heavier. So that fight was not going to go forward, unfortunately, and seems like she's fairly hungry because of that, understandably. She's actually facing Hannah the Hurricane Guy, who's making her bare knuckle debut. She's fighting out of Mississippi, but she has 5 pro fights in mixed martial arts. She's 4-1 in MMA, 1 win by strikes. But to be completely honest, looking at, again, the video, doing a little bit of scouting here, her hands are somewhat slow. She's not very good in the clinch and gets kind of tossed around very easily, but she looks very comfortable on the ground. Unfortunately, that's not something that's really going to help her in bare knuckle in the BKFC. So I would definitely be wary of Taylor Starling just kind of blitzing her and overwhelming her with her hands, because Hannah Guy, while very enthusiastic, very tough, is not particularly good with her hands that I have seen. Again, might have improved it, might have worked on it tremendously, but I would hope so for her sake, because I kind of think that Taylor Starling is going to be a bit too much for her. The third listed fight is at middleweight at 175 pounds in the BKFC on this Tampa card, and it features David Redneck Mundell against Stanislav Grosu. Kind of an interesting fight, in my opinion. And David Mundell is 2-1 in the BKFC. He's got 2 knockouts, 2 knockout wins, obviously, fighting out of Florida, and he has 15 mixed martial arts fights. He's 10-5, 2 wins by strikes. So it's kind of difficult to judge exactly what that means with how many wins are coming by strikes and whatnot in mixed martial arts, because that's not always the greatest indicator of how much power somebody has or how good a puncher they are in terms of technique. But nonetheless, important to know, he's 0-1 in kickboxing, and he's 0-1 in boxing, only has 1 draw. He punches very wide, but he actually has pretty good footwork, surprisingly. So, it's pretty interesting in my opinion, but interesting also because of the matchup. Stanislav Grosu is making his bare knuckle debut, but he has, it looks to be extensive foreign MMA and kickboxing experience from what I've seen. He's fighting out of Romania, but he's from Moldova, I believe, and also he's only 1 amateur MMA bout on record, going 0-1 with a loss by stoppage. Again, according to Tapology, but if you just do a video search on Google, there's a lot of video of him. So obviously he has a lot of experience. He has good hands. He's pretty comfortable in the clinch, although probably a little bit more comfortable on the ground from what I've seen. But he can hold his own, and he's a fighter with a lot of combat sports experience coming in here against Redneck Mundell. So this should be fairly interesting in terms of a barometer for Grosu, whether or not he belongs in bare knuckle or wants to continue in bare knuckle, but also kind of a barometer for David Mundell to see what he can do with a fighter who has a lot of experience in other combat sports, but none in bare knuckle. Fairly interesting fight, at least for that reason. This fourth bout on this BKFC Tampa card is a flyweight bout, 125 pounds in BKFC. It's between Little Scrappy Delaney Bailey, who is 1-0 with 1 knockout in the BKFC, against Savage Jenny Clausius, who is 0-1 in the BKFC. So Delaney Bailey's fighting out of Florida. She has 5 fights in mixed martial arts, going 3-2. She's actually 0-4 in boxing. But that's another kind of interesting thing about bare knuckle, is that you can see these other records in other combat sports, and they don't necessarily mean what you think they mean in bare knuckle. There are a number of reasons for that, but for the time being, until a lot of competition really fills out, for now, these records in other combat sports are not meaningless. They're good to know, but they're difficult to really judge by in terms of bare knuckle. Now, from what I've seen, Delaney Bailey, pretty good hands and decent in the clinch, but against Jenny Clausius, who is only 0-1, she's fighting out of Tennessee. She has a lot more kickboxing experience and a lot more MMA experience. 7 fights, 3-4 in MMA, 1-1 with 1 knockout in kickboxing. She has good hands. She's very fast, comfortable in the clinch. But one of the issues is her stature. She's fairly short, and she often has to kind of punch upwards towards opponents. That's not going to be, I don't think, a huge issue here, because there's only like 1 or 2 inches in height difference. But that being said, she's very eager to fight. And I would say that this fight is something where these 2 very very scrappy and motivated fighters are going to clash, and it's going to be fun. The fifth bout on this BKFC card is a welterweight bout at 165 pounds between Jordan Nash. That's a name that a number of people might know if you're in the mixed martial arts community, against Noah Cutter, who you probably are familiar with if you've watched many BKFC events. Jordan Nash is 2-0 with 2 decisions in the BKFC, and he's fighting out of Florida, but he has 2 fights in mixed martial arts. He's 1-1 with 1 knockout. Good hands, actually very good hands, but he fights with a fairly low guard, and that's something that's kind of concerning, especially in bare knuckle, where you can't really afford to get hit a whole lot. Whereas in boxing and even in MMA to a certain extent, you can roll with punches, you can kind of absorb them and take the mustard off them a little bit. But in bare knuckle, you can't really afford to get hit a whole lot at all. Even just glancing punches can open you up really badly. So the low guard kind of fighters, that kind of concerns me in bare knuckle. And so that's something that I'd be kind of worried about. And he can also be hit fairly easily. From the videos that I've seen, he doesn't have super great defense, but he swings very freely, and he's dangerous when you're in close. And he's also, I would say he's decent in the clinch. He kind of gets pushed around a little bit. That's something that I look for, because the clinch game is what kind of differentiates classical boxing, Western boxing, stand-up boxing, whatever you want to call it, from bare knuckle boxing, at least at this stage. And so that lack of clinch work, or that lack of strength in the clinch, I think is really, that does not help you in the BKFC whatsoever. But against Noah Cutter, he might have kind of drawn a little bit of a lucky card. We'll have to see. But Noah Cutter's 1-3 with 1 knockout in the BKFC, fighting out of Florida. He's got 6 fights in MMA, 1-5, 1 win by strikes. But he does something that I think is the hallmark of, and from what I've seen from my experience watching, is the hallmark of a kind of an experienced fighter who doesn't really know what they're doing. Constantly switching stances from left-handed to right-handed. It's a bad idea, generally speaking, and most trainers are going to tell you the exact same thing. Switching stances is not for most fighters. It's for an extremely small portion of fighters. But Noah Cutter does that all the time, just constantly back and forth. But he's very easy to hit, and he has 3 stoppage losses in a row in BKFC. So this is a barometer. I used that word before, but this is kind of a litmus test or barometer for Jordan Nash to see, I think, where he is and how he figures into the welterweight division, whether or not he can also do what 3 other fighters have done to Noah Cutter, and can he step in and stop him and assert himself? Because if he does not, then perhaps they know what they need to do with him in terms of how hard they need to push, and whether or not they need to push him toward a title shot in the BKFC. But that being said, I would probably favor Jordan Nash, at least on talent alone and on not having been stopped a bunch of times in the BKFC. But it's a good, interesting fight for the fact that we're gonna learn something in this fight. All right, the 6th fight on this BKFC in Tampa card is a fight that involves 2 experienced mixed martial artists in Peter the Joker Pettis versus Robbie Problems Peralta. So Peter Pettis is making his bare knuckle debut. He's fighting out of Washington, D.C. area, and he has 15 mixed martial art bouts, going 9-6 with 2 wins by strikes. But he's very stiff. He's got a kind of an awkward upright stance. He's just kind of got a strange style. There's a bunch of video on him if you go look. He has a very strange style, doesn't really move his head in the classical sense, but relies on doing that kind of thing, slipping his head back, and avoiding punches that way, which is kind of a recipe for disaster if you don't have really good reflexes. And he seems to rely on his reflexes in that regard. I think against Robbie Peralta, that could be a big issue. He's 1-0 in another bare knuckle organization. So he's 1-0 in bare knuckle fights. Fighting out of California, he has 28 fights in mixed martial arts, going 19-9, 5 wins by strikes. He's a very good puncher, but he's been knocked out a few times, and he's been chinned pretty good. I would say he is a somewhat suspect chin because of those losses, but he obviously swings very freely and believes in his power when he throws, and he has a number of knockouts on his record. So this should be a fight where I couldn't imagine this is going to be lasting the distance. I think that both of these guys punch pretty well, and they both have the kinds of styles where someone's going to make a mistake and something funky is going to happen. The seventh fight, the penultimate fight on this BKFC in Tampa card, is at heavyweight. That's 205 pounds and above in the BKFC. It's featuring Brian Cromer against Joshua Sanchez. So Brian Cromer is 1-0 in bare knuckle. It's in another organization. The win comes from another organization. He's fighting out of Maine. One mixed martial arts fight, and he's 1-0 but with an injury win. So it's kind of, who knows what that means or what happened there. He's another guy who, from what I've seen, switches stances, and he's kind of quick to take a fight to the ground in mixed martial arts from what I saw. And because of that, he has somewhat unknown punching power and technique with his hands. There was a lot of clinch work, a lot of mixed martial arts clinch work from what I saw, and a lot of grappling. So I really have no idea what his technique is like with his hands. And for his part, Joshua Sanchez, who is making his bare knuckle debut, I could not find really any information at all. So that was the rare occasion on this BKFC card where I couldn't really find anything. But hey, they're heavyweights, big boys throwing down. That always winds up being dangerous for a host of reasons and often fun. So the eighth fight, rounding out the main card on BKFC in Tampa, is at 135 pounds. That's bantamweight in BKFC. It's Joshua Ridge, who is making his bare knuckle debut against a guy I actually know, not super well, but I do know, in Gerald Gregory, or Grigori, I believe it's actually pronounced. So Joshua Ridge is fighting out of Florida. Again, don't really know too much about him apart from that, but Gerald Grigori is 0-1 in bare knuckle. It's from another organization. He has 0-2 record in professional boxing. One of his professional fights I actually called myself ringside commentating for 2 Pound Sports and Entertainment, which is a promotional company with former world champion Steve 2 Pound Forbes. And Gerald Grigori was the opponent for the former Oregon Golden Gloves winner, Lorenzo Caldera, in his professional debut. And so Gerald Grigori unfortunately got knocked out not too long into that fight. And so I didn't really learn too much. But going by his Tapology record, obviously, he's fighting out of Montana. You can find out that much. But he's 2-6 in amateur mixed martial arts. So I really don't know what to make of what he's coming in fighting like. All I can tell you is that he has a very wily style. It's very unorthodox, and he looks like he can punch pretty decently. So it should be fairly interesting, at least personally, to see what happens with him in this fight. But that's the final fight, rounding out that main BKFC card. But that's not it, actually. However, there's a very fun prelim portion of the BKFC in Tampa card, which I believe should be available for free on YouTube, on the BKFC YouTube channel. They usually are. But the opening bout, or at least according to their schedule, is at welterweight, 165 pounds, featuring Rynell Riley, who's making his bare knuckle debut, against Trucon Carson, also making his bare knuckle debut. Rynell Riley, fighting out of Florida, 1-1 in professional boxing. So I've actually never seen him fight. I don't really know too much about him. But Trucon Carlson, fighting out of North Carolina, 2-0 in MMA, 1 stoppage by strike as far as the MMA wins. He has a very high guard, solid hands from the outside, but inside he kind of looked like he's looking for like a gable grip, more kind of a wrestling or grappling style than more dirty boxing or clinch fighting and mixed martial arts fights from what I could see. But he does have amateur boxing experience from what I could also see on the Google video search. And he looks like he's actually pretty decent, and he looks like he did a lot of good body work. I would imagine that Trucon Carlson, unless Rynell Riley has a lot of talent and a lot of skill, Trucon Carson is probably coming into this fight to win and look pretty good from what I could see. The kind of middle fight sandwiched between the two others on the BKFC prelims is at featherweight, which is 145 pounds, featuring Steve-O Morris making his bare knuckle debut against Jorge Gonzalez Rolon, Also making his bare knuckle debut, Steve Morris, fighting out of Florida. He has 16 amateur MMA fights, according to Tapology. He's 5'11", with 2 of those 5 wins coming by strikes. He appears to have good kickboxing or Muay Thai training, from what I could see, and good hands, a real emphasis on striking in his MMA fights, but he does leave his chin out there quite a bit. Now, the Muay Thai training, from what I can tell, is definitely a big advantage going into bare knuckle, because of the allowance of clinch fighting, and because you're allowed to fight if you have one hand free, and you're encouraged really to do more clinch fighting rather than the fight just being broken up right away when there's a clinch. And so that Muay Thai experience, I would imagine, really helps. But against Jorge Gonzalez Rolon, Steve Morris might not even really need it, to be totally frank. Gonzalez Rolon's fighting out of Indiana. He's 0-10 in professional boxing. 8 of those 10 losses are coming by knockout. And he does have some amateur MMA experience, going off of the video search. Very unorthodox style, wily style, takes a lot of risks. It just doesn't really bode well for him against a guy who has a lot more combat sports experience, I would imagine. But again, in bare knuckle, man, anything can happen. The last fight on this BKFC and Tampa card on the preliminary portion is at welterweight, 165 pounds. Again, a couple welterweight fights also on this BKFC card, potentially setting up some future showdowns, but we'll see. So this welterweight fight features Joshua Sykes, who is 0-1 the BKFC, against Michael Stripling, making his bare knuckle debut. Joshua Sykes, fighting out of Florida, 2-0 in MMA, and considers himself more of a stand-up boxer or striker than anything. Now, he didn't really do enough clinch work or clinch fighting in his BKFC debut against Tony Soto, in my opinion, and I think that was a big reason why he lost, and that's why he's 0-1. He didn't look awful or anything like that by any stretch of the imagination. He just didn't quite work enough. And so if he learns his lesson, he can come in against Michael Stripling looking totally different. Michael Stripling, also fighting out of Florida. He's 0-1 in MMA, but interestingly, he also has a Muay Thai bout, and he won by knockout. The clinch experience, again, for Muay Thai, I think is a really big advantage for a lot of fighters. But the caveat here is that this Muay Thai bout took place at 125 pounds. So at 165 pounds, 40 pounds north, man, it really is. It's tough to say. But it's a very interesting matchup for that reason. We see, I think, a number of these other fighters kind of fighting outside of their comfort zone because, number one, they're obviously fighting outside of their preferred combat sports or their previously preferred combat sport. But also some of them are moving around a little bit in terms of weight, or perhaps able to be a little bit more comfortable and not have to cut weight the way that they would in boxing or MMA. So some of these fights have some little asterisks on them for those reasons. And again, very interesting stuff. So that's your scouting report for this BKFC and Tampa event on December 9th. Hopefully, if you do a little bit of gambling, this might help you. I don't know, maybe it won't. Not really sure. But if you do any gambling on there, that might help you a little bit, and also might kind of give you a little bit of a reacquaintance or acquaintance as far as what BKFC and bare knuckle are all about and what kind of fighters are often participating in these kinds of cards. But in the meanwhile, as you wait for another podcast or another video show, if you wouldn't mind, if you're on YouTube watching this, for instance, subscribe to the Knuckles and Glove podcast there. If you're listening through, for instance, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, any of those other means, please subscribe there too. And in any event, also leave a nice little comment. Always appreciated a little review. And if you are on social media, for instance, go ahead and follow me, Patrick Connor, at Patrick M. Connor. And if you are on Facebook, the Knuckles and Gloves podcast, also, of course, on there. And thank you so much for listening in. Really appreciate it. Take it easy, everybody.